Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022, with an estimated 150,000 troops. By invading Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin set off a chain reaction from the United States and its allies in Europe and Asia, who imposed swift and harsh economic sanctions. Sanctions that are designed to cripple Russia's economy through the target of their oil, gas, and coal industries. If Putin continues to cling to his war in Ukraine, the Russian economy will pay the price. In fact, experts predict the economy will fall into oblivion, with an impending recession and massive GDP declines. 6 months of Western sanctions and frozen assets have drained the Russian economy, with more sanctions coming in December. Needless to say, it's not looking good for Putin. If Western sanctions and trade embargoes continue into 2023, Russia's economy could completely implode. This is a story of how Putin's economy is about to evaporate. As of 2022, Russia is considered one of the world's superpowers, rich in oil, coal, and natural gas. Over the years, they've made themselves an indispensable resource to countries across Europe, many of whom are reliant on Russia for the majority of their natural gas supply. It all began in the 19th century, when petroleum was drilled in the oil-rich region of Baku. But it wasn't until the early 1900s that Russia emerged as a global oil producer, mainly thanks to foreign investment. Shell established itself as one of the world's leading oil companies by beginning production in southern Russia and investing in a transport network to move the oil onto the global market. Following the 1917 revolution, there was a departure of foreign investments, and the subsequent Soviet oil industry was born. Starting with oil fields in European Russia being brought on stream in the 1930s and 40s, followed by resources in Western Siberia being explored and developed in the 60s. Supply pipelines were also built, leading into 11 Soviet states, including Ukraine. The pipelines flowed further into Europe and tightened the grip of the Soviet Union on their satellite states. During this time frame, Russia had a booming economy, and its GDP was on par with that of Japan. The Soviets were able to find and produce oil in vast quantities and construct mass amounts of infrastructure in harsh conditions that are still in service today. It was a great time in Russia's economic history. Money and technology were flowing into the country while oil and gas were flowing out, and for a while, the system worked. But all good things must come to an end. At the start of the 1990s marked the downfall of the Russian economy. The energy market took a tumble, and the price of oil began to steadily decline across the world. Suddenly, the Kremlin, which is a fortified complex within the city of Moscow, was in desperate need of foreign money. This ultimately led the Russian oil industry to become privatized and owned by a small number of powerful people. This decision resulted in a backlash from the Russian people as they were experiencing an economic collapse, which they blamed on the oligarch of politics. What this instability leads to is the rise of one Vladimir Putin. By the time Putin came into power, the price of international oil had risen, and Russia found its footing as an economic power in the 21st century. It's Russia's wealth of natural resources that has kept its economy strong over the past decades. With the largest natural gas reserves in the world, Russia is the biggest exporter of natural gas and one of the top 3 biggest exporters of oil. In 2021, revenue from oil and natural gas made up 45% of Russia's federal budget. That's almost half of their federal budget. An economy based on the exports of oil and natural gas cannot prosper forever because they are cyclical assets. The price of oil and natural gas will not always be high, and when it drops, the economy suffers, just as it did during the 1990s in Russia. Over the years, Russia and Europe have struck trade deals which have led to Europe importing 40% of its natural gas from Russia. Germany and the UK are especially dependent on Russia's supply to power their countries. Prior to Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, Russia's economy was extremely strong. In 2020, they had the number 11 economy in the world by nominal GDP. Revenue data from 2019 shows crude oil as Russia's biggest export, accounting for $123 billion. Gas made up $23.6 billion, and coal $17.6 billion. China was the leading destination for their exports in 2019, taking 14.9% of the total value. followed by the Netherlands at 7.4%, the UK at 6.9%, Germany at 5.5%, and Belarus at 4.7%. Russia had a robust economy and strong trade deals with powerful countries in the West. Money and technology were once again flowing in and oil and gas flowing out. But all that changed on February 24, 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine. A choice that may ultimately lead to the demise of the Russian economy, thanks to a rapid coordinated response from the West. Economic sanctions and trade embargoes have been enforced by allied countries across the world to cripple the Russian economy, lower their standard of living, and weaken their ability to fund the war. About half of Russia's foreign reserves, roughly $315 billion, have been sanctioned, as major Russian banks have had their offshore accounts frozen. Some of the harshest sanctions imposed have been from Russia's biggest importers, the US, the UK, and the EU. The US is banning all Russian oil and gas imports. The UK is phasing out Russian oil by the end of 2022, and the EU will ban imports of Russian oil brought by sea from December 2022. Oil sales make up 40% of Russia's total exports, and they are helping to fund the war in the Ukraine. The EU's plan to ban 90% of Russian oil imports by the end of 2022 should have a lasting impact on the Russian economy. Western sanctions have drastically altered Russia's relationship with the outside world and isolated them economically from the West. 6 months in, and people are questioning if these sanctions have strangled the Russian economy as they were intended. The impact of sanctions on Russia's economy. Although gas prices have remained high, Russia's gas production is down 30% as countries across the EU have been scrambling to reduce their reliance on Russian gas. The Kremlin has also turned off Nord Stream 1, a main gas supply pipeline to Europe due to the current political climate post-invasion. But without the sales of natural gas to Europe, Russia's gas industry is struggling. Even the inflated price of gas doesn't make up for the loss in volume. Unless Putin can sell that gas to China and India to make up the deficit, Russia's economy will suffer. This is an almost impossible task for the Kremlin, as the gas isn't liquefied and it must travel through pipelines. Pipelines that just don't exist from Russia to India or China. There's only one pipeline to China, but it's not big enough to carry large amounts of gas and would equal approximately 10% of the gas supply Russia sells to Europe. Where the EU has been light on gas sanctions with Russia, they've been harsh on oil ones. Once again, this would be okay if the Kremlin could pivot to the east and sell all of its oil to China and India. But Russia's infrastructure is old, and it takes tankers 35 days for oil to reach those destinations and only 1 day to get to Europe. Even with China and India buying oil from Russia, they don't make up the volume of sales the EU did. All this is evidence of Western sanctions working. The previously abundant Russian economy was built on sales of oil and natural gas. But with their biggest customers no longer interested, Russia's economy has begun to feel the heat. Western sanctions have left Russia in a financial deficit, with no one coming to their rescue. The Kremlin has had around half of its financial reserves frozen by offshore banks. This lack of financial assistance, combined with Western sanctions, has slowed down the Russian economy significantly. Russia has reported inflation at 15% and monthly wages to be down by around 6%, adjusted for inflation. However, any data reported on the economic status of Russia's export and import numbers, monthly output, oil and gas, air travel, or any other categories have been suppressed by Putin. The data he is releasing at present has been cherry-picked to convey the strength of Russia's economy and breathe discontent into the West to weaken their resolve. It's also important to note the ruble is a managed currency. There's pretty much no market for it outside of Russia. This is the reason it hasn't fallen as it would have otherwise. Trade embargoes have also had an adverse effect on Russia, impacting their quality of life and ability to access necessary goods. Food prices have skyrocketed, but pensions and wages have not kept up. Many Russians have been pushed below the poverty line and have been forced to stand in line for humanitarian aid and access to basic necessities. Beyond trade embargoes and economic sanctions, Russia's economy is also suffering from the biggest private enterprise exit in history. almost 1,200 multinational corporations have pulled out of the country since the war began. Big names like McDonald's, Apple, Visa, MasterCard and Starbucks have shut down operations and closed their stores across Russia. This has caused an estimated loss of $200 billion in revenue, a loss of about 12 to 15% direct employment rate and around 35 to 40% indirect employment rate, leaving hundreds of thousands of Russian people without jobs. The financial sector has also been hit hard, as foreign banks have withdrawn from the market and sold their stakes in Russian banks, resulting in the loss of billions of dollars. Additionally, there's been a post-invasion brain drain, with as many as 700,000 Russians fleeing the country since the war began. The number of people leaving Russia is a sign of economic collapse. These people are leaving their homes and their jobs because they no longer see a future in Putin's Russia. A brain drain also means that well-educated and skilled young people are leaving the Russian job market and creating a shortage of trained professionals across every economic sector. The global impact of the Ukraine crisis. The most universal consequence of this war has been the rising price of oil and gas. This has been felt by people all across the globe as energy prices climb to new highs. However, the United States, Asia and the Pacific appear to have escaped the exorbitant energy prices predicted throughout Europe this winter. Russia is a natural resource superpower, and in a very convenient coincidence, the rest of Europe, aside from Norway, has very few natural resources in the way of gas and oil. Even with economic sanctions in place, the EU has resisted implementing an outright ban on Russian gas due to their dependence on it. Since the EU imports 40% of its natural gas from Russia, any harsh energy sanctions that are implemented could have an adverse impact on already climbing energy prices. The impending winter has been a source of concern for much of Europe. With energy prices as high as they are, the cost of living is becoming unaffordable. The EU is preparing for an energy crisis so serious, rolling blackouts may occur over winter. But Western sanctions aren't entirely to blame for this crisis. In the act of retaliation, Russia has set out their own sanctions by shutting off Nord Stream 1 and leaving the EU to scramble for new power supplies. Germany has already moved ahead with creating liquefied natural gas facilities, so they can pick up gas from Norway and the United States. As they've been hit the hardest by the lack of Russian gas flowing into Europe, while they have a solid plan in place, many of their new resources will not be available until 2023, which still begs the question, will Germany have enough gas to get through winter? The current shortfall of gas throughout Europe is approximately 150 billion cubic meters, which have driven energy prices up 8 times the average of the past decade. Gas supply is a particularly delicate balance across Russia and the rest of Europe. As Russia relies on the sale and export of gas to keep its economy afloat, the EU relies on it as their main energy source. The two economies are tied together, and given the unprecedented length of the war and unaffordable gas prices, Europe must find a way to balance economic sanctions and still keep the power running this winter. The future of Putin's economy. Russia's reliance on its energy sector for economic stability is a double-edged sword. The oligarchy of individuals who control Russia's oil, gas and coal industries has become extremely wealthy. But this focus on a singular industry and output has resulted in extreme wealth inequality throughout the country. Although recent years have allowed for a growing middle class within Russian society, the recent economic sanctions and setbacks will result in a rapid decline in Russia's middle class. This could lead to a return to Soviet economic woes and see many Russians fall behind the poverty line. Putin's economy was never going to last forever. The dictator is living in his own world, surrounded by people who tell him what he wants to hear. He also has built an authoritarian system with strong TV propaganda that to this day highly affects most uneducated Russians. Putin appears not to have a clue about what it takes to build a successful and prosperous capitalist society, and he probably doesn't care about it either. Instead, the man probably wants to go down in history as a conqueror. And to achieve that, he is now mercilessly sending newly mobilized people of Russia to die at war for his imperial ambitions. The country whose economy is dying, people are leaving, will never outcompete booming economies like the Western powers. You gotta pay for these military expenditures, and at the end of the day, the juicy oil and gas revenues will run out. Many similar regimes of the past failed, and hopefully this one will come to an end soon as well. Vladimir Putin's Soviet style of governing has prevented Russia from becoming an economic superpower. The economic catastrophe this war has created will take years to recover from. Recent predictions have said it won't be until 2030 that Russia's economy will return to the prosperity it experienced prior to the invasion of Ukraine. This is assuming multinational corporations and foreign banks choose to return to Russia in a post-war climate. However, the Kremlin's disregard for intellectual property rights and immediate reopening of foreign companies who exited the Russian market provides little incentive for them to ever return. Companies such as McDonald's have been reopened and funded by the Russian government with a different name but offering the same product. This attempt to build a self-sustaining economy is futile at best. Without mass amounts of gas and oil money flowing into the country, the Kremlin won't be able to fund replacing all companies that pulled out of their market. Russia's GDP is expected to drop 11% over the next year, and if the war continues, its GDP may keep declining. Quality of life has taken a hit as well due to mounting trade embargoes from the West. Russia only exports commodities, and they have to import almost everything else. Russian imports are down by roughly 60%, leaving the Kremlin scrambling for alternate supplies. The Russian government has had to change regulations to allow the sale of vehicles without airbags and anti-lock brakes, as they're almost impossible to produce. It is safe to assume that this will not be the only adjustment made to account for the lack of resources within the country. If Western economic sanctions and trade embargoes continue, Russia's economy will collapse. Although gas sanctions have been few and far between, countries within the EU have already begun seeking out alternative sources of energy and investing in the infrastructure to make this possible. There are already plans in place across the EU to phase out Russian energy entirely over the next few years, a strategy that would land a devastating blow to the Kremlin's biggest industry. A complete ban on Russian energy from the West would result in a 20% decrease in Russia's economy, which would truly cripple their most important economic sector. A weak Russian economy will do more than lower the median wage and cause a decline in GDP. It will also weaken Russia's principal instrument of international influence and deepen American and European economic ties. This, combined with trade embargoes barring Russia from getting hold of key technologies, will result in the superpower moving backwards. It's impossible for Russia to stay on the cutting edge of technology without importing certain pieces crucial to its development. Additionally, military technology trade embargoes can also prevent Russia from obtaining key components for their pre-existing military equipment, which would have potentially catastrophic consequences for their war in Ukraine. The loss of Russia's educated elite will also make it much harder for the Kremlin to rebuild a competitive economy. Without any qualified specialist in arts, engineering, science and technology, the country will struggle to recover from this economic disaster. As a natural resource superpower, Russia still holds the keys to Europe's current energy crisis, but the political climate has made their economic ties impossible to navigate. If Putin continues his war on Ukraine, he risks Russia's entire economy, the well-being of his people, and his own position as head of state. Even if he is able to continue funding this war for the time being, it would be at the expense of the Russian people. Although Russia still wields power over Europe's energy supply, the EU has been quick to find alternative energy resources and begin funding infrastructure to support them. The looming risk of the EU entirely phasing out Russia's energy supply, along with their pre-existing economic sanction packages targeting oil and coal, paint a bleak picture of Russia's economic future.